It's open back and biocellulose. But does it make sense? Before I begin, I'd like to thank the good folks at megaaudio.de. They are Germany's exclusive distributor for many high-end audio brands, including Fostex, with a focus on the pro audio segment, and they were kind enough to loan me this headphone for the purpose of this review. At around 1,500 euros, the Fostex TH808 is not aimed at the average mortal. Utilizing one of their classic 50mm dynamic biocellulose diaphragm transducers, they've skipped the Urushi lacquer of the TH900 and tuned these for open-back wooden cups. Having previously auditioned this headphone at high-end Munich, and then looking at the marketing for this headphone on the Fostex website, I felt a bit lost. Part of me was expecting a more grandiose performance like that of the TH900 Mark II, while another was almost hoping for a technical masterpiece. Initially, I felt like I got neither of those things. At a certain price point, a headphone must stand out in more ways than one to justify its own existence and market value, so this is one of the few times in my life I've listened to a headphone for over 2 weeks to form some solid opinions that I can stand by. So let's get into it. Since almost everything about the build and design is fabulous, I'll just focus on some outlying points. For a proprietary 2-pin system, the cable plugs and headphone sockets are labeled, so when you see both L's or R's, you know they are in the correct orientation before inserting, although as usual I would have preferred to see a more common connector type used. I really dig the small details like the glossy logo and left and right indicators on the mostly matte finished headband piece. While the cable is actually moderately tolerable despite being on the thicker side with a fabric sheath, it's just too long. I think it wouldn't hurt to include different cable lengths at this price point. The extra large plug housing on the end is a rare but welcome feature that all but eliminates the chance of pulling the plug out by the cable. Overall, it looks like every part of the headphone is manufactured and finished as good as you could reasonably expect given the materials used. But the inner headband appears to be made of a flexible plastic and has almost no padding. Now, I'm not saying they're uncomfortable, but I did get a small hot spot at the very top of the headband after around an hour or two, so while comfort is just as subjective as the sound, take that with some caution. The earpads are fair. They're not exactly cavernous, but should be suitable for most ears. The protein leather appears to be a high quality, and I think there is memory foam inside them. But somehow they trapped more moisture than I'm used to, and needed more hygiene maintenance than other headphones. I can see these getting uncomfortable in summer heat, but that extra surface area coming into contact with the skin actually securely ensures a proper base seal. The earpads are easy to remove or replace with these handy twist lock rings. This reveals a large piece of foam around the driver which covers most of the baffle vents and does a significant amount of heavy lifting for the bass tuning. Removing these foams clearly shows their purpose in the graphs. Even after a couple of weeks, I'm still a bit conflicted. On one hand, the technical prowess of these Fostex biocellulose drivers cannot be ignored. The combination of the extremely capable separation, presented in combination with a ballpark Harman tuning, is quite a rare treat. On the other hand, the soundstage is actually quite small, and the tuning is obviously coloured. I think it's easy to get caught up in the quest for a headphone with bigger soundstage, deeper bass, more linear tunings, area treble, and so on, and then forget about what the intention behind this headphone's design might have been, and what it might do differently or even uniquely. This is definitely one such case, and required some deeper reflection and insight. To be as fair and rational as possible, I only compared it directly against some other open-back headphones, with Fosi Audio coming in clutch with the PH808 5-channel headphone amp, which made this part so much easier than usual. I reviewed that amplifier last week, links are in the description. First, the Sennheiser HD650. Immediately you notice the TH808 sounds more impactful and everything sounds sharper, clearer, and cleaner. The HD650 by contrast sounds somewhat thin, mid-range focused, light, and slightly diffused. They're almost polar opposites, the HD650 being polite and gentle, and the TH808 being unsympathetic and aggressive. Next, the Hi-Fi Man HE500. My copy is a little modified, but not too far from the original. Going from the TH808 to the HE500, you immediately get hit by the sense of scale and depth that was missing in the performance. While the overall subjective gap was clear, with HE500 being the more neutral, the TH808 edged out in its presentation of tactile sub-bass. The HE500's bass was actually deeper and equally textured, but it didn't slam with toe-tapping oversaturation that is much needed with some heavy metal recordings, for example. Finally, I want to compare it with something a bit unusual, the Altier Cal 1H. As you can see, these two headphones measure very similarly, but they sound quite different. This comparison especially helped me isolate some finer characteristics of the TH808 that I was only aware of previously by ear. Firstly, the TH808 bass feels more impactful, and I think the extra energy between 60 and 200 Hz is responsible for this. With some recordings, this can edge quickly into fatigue territory. Also remember, the TH808 ear pads are non-porous protein leather, while the Altier's pads are velour fabric. This difference in bass impact and fatigue was significant for me. Overall, the slight difference in mid-range tuning didn't make much difference to me. If anything, the TH808 might have sounded slightly more saturated here, while the Altier sounded more distant and laid back. The Fostex is objectively more accurate here, and it sounds like it too for the most part, but every now and then, with some recordings, I got a hint of oversaturation. The treble is where things definitely get spicy. The peak at 7 and 8 kHz gets a bit exhausting after a while. It most noticeably gives a slightly artificial sheen that makes cymbals sound more splashy instead of sparkly. On some recordings with weaker treble, it's actually fine for the most part, even though it's objectively not accurate. The last time I slated a headphone for having a tiny soundstage, namely the Audeze Max, well, some people were really not happy with me in the comments, so I'll try to tone it down this time. The soundstage on these is kind of pathetic. This is the kind of staging I know from average-sized, closed-back headphones. With that out of the way, I think I've got a decent idea of the philosophy behind this headphone. Tuned close to Harman, I don't think this was an attempt to make the usual fodder. There are simply too many headphones already doing this. The TH808 instead goes on a full rampage of oversaturation. I think any attempt to increase the staging with this transducer would have in turn reduced its ability to slam this hard and force detail down your ear throat. It is clearly not the final word in dynamic driver resolution, but it's also far from a slouch, with spectacular extension on both extremes of its frequency response. I think this headphone would be a useful tool for studios to test their recordings on headphones near the limits of widely acceptable coloration. It performs with such aggression and clarity while remaining insightful. I also believe Audeze Maxwell lovers might be particularly interested in giving this headphone an audition. If, however, you're looking for something more relaxing or of pure fidelity, then perhaps it's not for you. Ultimately, I found this headphone too aggressive, fatiguing, and the sound was too localized inside my head. But I also know there are people who do enjoy this type of presentation, so I can't discredit it based only upon my own subjective preferences. I can only remain consistent in the hope that subjective patterns emerge and my reviews do not become contradictory, thereby remaining informative. Take it easy, and I'll see you in the next one.